In this lecture, I'm going to go a little bit deeper into this idea of conflict expression. I brought this up in the foundational lecture as an important way to think about how to cool conflict or perhaps even avoid the escalation of conflict to begin with. So, conflict expression theory in teams is relatively new. Some of this research was published about 2 to 3 years ago, and has really been trying to unpack, again, the challenge is why is it that some teams can engage in healthy task conflict and use that to benefit, use that to raise and learn different diverse perspectives in the team and use that information to help the team perform better, and why do some teams fall apart, right? Why do they try to engage in that kind of conflict and then end up escalating that conflict into some sort of personal relationship challenge, emotional conflict, etc. So expression has to do with exactly that, sort of the communication processes by which conflict is conducted in a team. So if we think about, what does this mean? We can think about what kind of reactions are we trying to have when we have conflict in teams. We would like to have as people feeling trustworthy, so that if somebody challenges your idea, gives a counterpoint to it, brings up something that's sort of in direct opposition to what you're proposing, that you have trust and that you therefore will hear them out and listen to them and try to think through what they're offering or suggesting. In another lecture for this week, we'll talk about psychological safety, which the foundational lecture within the team creativity and innovation talks about this as a sense that people feel comfortable raising concerns. They feel comfortable pointing out that an error has been made by themselves or somebody else in the team. They feel comfortable being vulnerable with each other. So what we hope is that if we have conflict, people feel this and they're comfortable and they maintain a sense of trust and psychological safety in the team. We would like to not reduce those two psychological states. We also would like to have people keep sharing information, and we don't want them to escalate conflict. And ultimately, we're trying to both improve team performance by benefiting from task conflict, and we're also trying to keep team satisfaction up. So if we remember way back to some of the first lectures from last week, we know that problems in teams are a big source of dissatisfaction at work for many people. So we want teams to have good conflict management so that people maintain a sense of satisfaction, which is an important part of both team effectiveness and maintaining an engaged and satisfied workforce. We're going to think about what is conflict expression really all about. We could think about maybe two different scenarios in a team. One scenario, let's have two members of the team, Pat and Tom. And in one scenario, Pat tries to explain why she thinks the allocation to the project is adequate, and even suggests that they can probably find some discretionary funds to try to allocate and seed the project work. Tom listens. He listens to everything she has to say, but he remains concerned, and he expresses some sense of concern while respectfully listening and hearing Pat out. He listens, and after he's had his listening, he suggests that she may not quite fully understand the hidden costs and the situation, and they might want to discuss this further. And Pat disagrees at this point. Let's take a different scenario. Same two people, Pat and Tom, disagreeing over the resources being allocated to the project. And Pat opens with strong defense, using strong language, using kind of elevated voice, and unequivocally states that the allocation is adequate and might even be more than what's needed, right? So we can think about kind of elevating the voice, using some emphatic language, and not being willing to budge. As she's making this sort of emphatic statement, Tom interrupts her and says that she does not have the expertise. She simply doesn't understand the hidden cost of the situation. And he unequivocally demands that she opened the situation again, and Pet disagrees. So we have two situations here, right? The same two people, and there are some variations in what happened, and some of it has to do with the language and the tone that's taken in the team, and some of it has to do with the respectfulness, listening, and willingness to hear people out. And hopefully this should sound a little familiar. Part of this is inside of that idea of mindfulness. In mindfulness, we wouldn't have the interruption and the jumping down on somebody before they were able to deliver their idea or suggestion. But what's different here also in conflict expression is there's a sense that when people use these upcycler languages, strong adjectives, when they may increase the volume of their voice, maybe they have some emphatic body language going on, all of those things can escalate conflict because of the way it's being expressed. So conflict expression theory has identified two dimensions on which the communication and expression of conflict varies, and both of these dimensions have been shown to affect the outcomes of conflict processing in teams. So the first dimension is the directness of the opposition. So ultimately, conflict is some kind of opposition, right? We have differences of opinions. We have different viewpoints of how to move forward. So there's opposition. But the question is that opposition being addressed directly or indirectly? And is it being stated with some ambiguity, or is it stated with clarity? So we know that there are people who have very indirect expression of conflict. You know, they might say something like, if they're cold, they might say, I wonder if the door could be shut. Or I wonder if anybody else feels like the temperature's off in here, right? That's a very indirect way to express a concern. So it can confuse people if people aren't being clear and in fact making it clear that they actually have a conflict. So sometimes conflict can seethe and stay underground. People can feel like they are expressing their conflict, but if it's in this kind of indirect way, maybe Minnesota nice, maybe a little passive aggressive, all of those are negative, because if people aren't clear that there's a conflict happening, there's not really much they can do about it. It's also unclear what your particular position is. And in the final lecture for this deep dive into conflict, we'll talk about a negotiation perspective and why positions and interests are really important to understand to be able to resolve conflict. The other element of directness of opposition is who is expressing the conflict and to whom. And the most important thing here is that it should be expressed directly between the parties who are having the conflict. So if you go back to that material on social undermining I talked about, that would be indirectly, right? That would not be between the parties. So I have a problem with you, but instead of me raising it with you, I talk to somebody else on the team and complain about you. Or I talk to somebody else on the team and make them try to fix you or try to get you to change your mind. So all of those kinds of tactics are less productive in terms of effective conflict management in teams. And then the second dimension is the intensity of the opposition expressed. And this has two elements of it. It could be subversion. So it could be these attempts to overthrow or overcome. And sometimes that's forcing. So if you think about influence tactics, those hard tactics, trying to bully somebody into submission. Sometimes people raise their voice and shout at people. They try to intimidate, maybe threaten. So all of those would be ways that conflict expression would be extremely intense and extremely negative. The second part of opposition is entrenchment. You know, when somebody sets a stake in the ground and makes it very clear that they're not going to change, they have extremely high intensity of their opposition. When they express a lot of emotion, when they get elevated in emotion. And so again, we can see why this is the connection between the negative when there's task conflict and it turns into relationship conflict. So if we look at these two together, we can plot out sort of 4 different general types of conflict expression based on the level of intensity in the opposition and the directness of the conflict. And I'll talk just a little bit about what happens when we have conflict expression in these different quadrants. So first of all, let me move my picture out of here, actually, just go straight to the fully on the slide, I think. Let us have a chance to see this. Sorry about this, I didn't have the best layout of my slides here. Now I'm real time trying to fix it. Sorry. I'm going to stop worrying about that. Okay, so one of the things we know is that if we have high intensity and high directness, we can think of that as arguing. And what we know over here are some things that we would like to prevent in teams. This arrow is an up arrow of a negative process. And so when we have arguments occurring in teams, we elevate conflict spirals. And conflict spirals are where that task conflict sort of elevates into relationship conflict, which has people getting back at other people, and this escalation occurs. Interestingly enough, with a green, that means a good process. Arguing actually does reveal information. So if there's one saving grace from high intensity and high directness of conflict, information is being shared. However, a really other kind of problematic thing that happens is that negative emotions escalate. And when negative emotions escalate, we cannot process information very well. So even if there's information being exposed by this argument that's going on in the team, our capability as team members to really do much about it is really, really suppressed. So all things equal, arguments are not an effective way to address and raise and express conflict. Okay, so the next type of conflict expression is where we have high oppositional intensity. So again, a lot of that elevated vocal tone, a lot of that aggressive adjectives and language, maybe some body language as well. But we have low directness, so people are being indirect. And this is going to be undermining. And this, again, goes back to that presentation I talked about team mindfulness, where I shared what the idea of undermining is in teams. And this is, again, it's indirect, and this is where people are trying to address conflict indirectly, try to manipulate the situation by undermining and undercutting different people's perspectives in the team about the conflict. And what we see with undermining is that undermining is associated with only negative processes. So these arrows are all red. It does reduce conflict spirals because the conflict isn't actually so evident in the team. It's being done indirectly, kind of behind closed doors. It's quite negative because information isn't being revealed, because not everyone on the team understands there's a conflict and is aware of what's going on. So there's little opportunity to really recognize what's happening and be able to address that. And it absolutely does raise negative emotions because usually people don't like it when this is happening. And obviously, if it's discovered that someone is trying to undermine you, usually this just results in an escalation of tension, in particular between individuals in the team. So the third prototypical type of conflict expression is a situation where there's low intensity and there's low directness. And this has been named by Lori Weingart, who developed this theory, as disguised conflict. And so in disguised conflict, honestly, it's not always clear to people there is a conflict. There is, because people are feeling it and people are having differences of opinions, but it's not being actually raised or expressed in the team. So it cannot be resolved. So if we look at this, conflict spirals are sort of neutral because it's there, and it's not really escalating because it's not being addressed. But again, information is lacking, and to one degree or another, you're not going to have negative emotions to start with. But a disguised conflict will be festering and will cause problems, and at some point in time will be expressed. And I think what happens is oftentimes frustration boils over, and then we have this moving up into the argument category. So it's not a good idea to leave it down here and leave it indirect and not address it. So the final prototypical conflict expression style, if you will, is debate. And this is where we have low oppositional intensity and high directness. So people are expressing the conflict openly in the team. So people are aware there's a conflict, and the people who are having the conflict are sharing it with the people they are in conflict with. But they are doing it, back to my example, with careful language, with full listening, and with relatively restrained or constrained communication styles. And this approach to conflict expression we have all lit up in green here. So it reduces conflict spirals, because when people don't engage in that harsh, emotional, intense upcycling language and elevate the oppositional intensity, people are more able to stay in that cool cognition and keep the conflict as task conflict. The conflict is expressed, it's directly expressed. So as a result, this conflict expression style actually does increase the information available to the team to think about how to resolve the conflict. It at least keeps negative emotions at bay, if not reducing them. And it tends to elevate positive emotions because people can do something about the conflict, particularly as opposed to when conflict is in disguise. So this is what we're trying to achieve if we think about coaching and suggesting about how we approach the communication and expression of conflict in teams to make it more effective. So in this slide, I just wanted to share with you the survey items that Lori Weingart has developed to address each of these styles. So if we look at arguing, this would be a case of having high direct conflict and highly intense conflict expression. We quarrel, we argue, we fight, right? So language thinking about those kinds of descriptors would be arguments. Debate, if you remember, that's what we're really trying to achieve. Well, we engage in debates. We go back and forth. We deliberate, right? So thinking about that kind of language in how conflict is being expressed and managed. So when we have low directness but high intensity, that undermining happens. It's evidenced by dismissiveness in the team, by teasing, kind of negative humor, trying to make a target of a joke to someone who's having a conflict or disagreement, and also complaining, right? Leaving the team meeting, scurrying to someone's office, complaining and venting, right? All of those things would suggest we have undermining happening in the team, which is counterproductive. And then disguising, right? People are indirect, they're vague, maybe they avoid saying something, but in fact, they have a different opinion, but they're not sharing it. And so the team is unable to actually address and resolve that conflict when we have disguising. So this is just a way to think a little bit about what are you experiencing in your team? Which type of conflict expression do you think is going on? And to remind yourself that as best you can help as a coach and a leader of a team to try to support this more debating kind of open conflict expression. And in other words, the other thing is to think about what happens when you get into a more negative expression. So as a final point here, it matters, and it matters to effective conflict management. We want to try to achieve low oppositional intensity and direct expression, and try to express it via debate and deliberation. So these can be things like even setting up some expectations or norms, again, about detecting when things are getting emotional, detecting when things are getting heated, being willing to intervene and coach individuals in the team if somebody has a tendency to escalate with higher oppositional intensity in the team. Making sure that conflict is actually revealed. So processes like I discussed in the Team Creativity and Innovation foundational lecture about the nominal group technique. So methods to air and hear from everybody so that you actually know when there's a conflict present so that you can actually address that conflict and work to resolve it. So as a whole, conflict resolution and, conflict expression is really an important way to think about effective management of conflict in teams, and thinking about how do you set up the communication habits and the communication norms and the communication expectations to have debate. And if you see things other than debate happening, how do you think about the interventions you're going to take to try to slow down that escalation that could occur if people are engaging in more oppositionally intense or indirect conflict expression?